We are celebrating a momentous occasion this year in 2021. On July 21st, 1821, Andrew Jackson established Escambia and St. Johns counties. So we're celebrating 200 years as a county this year. Escambia County was created out of West Florida and was based out of Pensacola, and St. Johns County was established out of East Florida and based out of St. Augustine. The Suwannee River was the dividing line between the two counties. Approximately 60% of the counties in the state of Florida were actually carved from the original boundaries of St. Johns County. We actually predate the state of Florida by 24 years.
We also have another unexpected guest today, Brad Loretti. Brad works with the Stetson Kennedy Foundation and St. Johns County Parks to bring an artist in residency program to life at Beluthahatchee. So Brad's going to play a song for us today from his just released album, Go With The Flow. Brad's with This Frontier Needs Heroes. So welcome, Brad Loretti.
Thank you. Yeah, I've written quite a few songs now at Beluthahatchee, but I was there this last summer and I wrote a whole nother album that I have to record now. So every time I come here, I write a new album. But this one's song called Go With The Flow. Well, there's so many fish in the sea. If you don't think I'm special, why you talking to me? We can go on like this for many years, but I don't want to see you drown in tears. Well, you got to go with the flow. You gotta know and you gotta know. 'Cause if you miss the boat, you're gonna be sad, sad, sad. When I think of what I had, I could sit here feeling bad. But now I'm kinda glad that it's gone. Well, sometimes you sit and whine, sometimes you gotta sit and pine. Sometimes you drink yourself silly till you cry, cry, cry. But don't ask yourself why, just go get it done. 'Cause everything else is a waste of time. You gotta go with the flow. You gotta know and you gotta know. 'Cause if you miss the boat, you're gonna be sad, sad, sad. When I think of what I had, I can sit here feeling bad. But now I'm kinda glad that it's gone. Well, you know, sometimes it gets dark and gloomy. You can just slow down, don't be in a hurry. 'Cause if you're on the right road, you're gonna get there. There is no reason to despair. You gotta go with the flow. You gotta know and you gotta know. 'Cause if you miss the boat, you're gonna be sad, sad, sad. When I think of what I had, I can sit here feeling bad. Well, now I'm kinda glad that it's gone. Now I'm so glad that it's gone.
Thank you, Brad. I'm with the Stetson Kennedy Foundation, and we offer programs and events at Beluthahatchee Park, just a few miles north of here. Beluthahatchee is a twice designated literary landmark, honoring the works of Stetson Kennedy and his friend, Woody Guthrie, who wrote over 80 songs there. I grew up in Mandarin, a little bit farther north, And that's where I first met former St. Johns County naturalist Beverly Fleming. Beverly was a self-taught naturalist and an award-winning photographer and writer. She was a wealth of knowledge to the natural world and all who lived in it. You might not know this, but she was also a ditch witch. The ditch witches traveled around Northeast Florida and photographed native plants and species and wrote articles to educate us about them. We are in the process of republishing their works in the upcoming book, Legacy of the Ditch Witches, available soon through the Stetson Kennedy Foundation. Beverly introduced me to this magical place, Alpine Groves Park. Now, I'm gonna take y'all on a trip back in time. Did you bring your imagination caps? Let's put them on. Imagine. It's the 1700s in an area called New Switzerland. Imagine the sounds carried in the wind. Imagine the fragrances of the flora and fauna. This 55-acre park was part of the original land grant of Francis Philip Facio. He named his plantation New Switzerland after his former home. We learned more about him in this area from the writings of William Bartram. We might see him later, who traveled through documenting plants and animals. He mentions Facio as a very civil gentleman and describes his garden as having greater variety than any other. The Facio family stayed in the area until the 1800s. One of his granddaughters, Louisa, we might see her too, is remembered for owning and operating what is now called the Jimenez Facio home in St. Augustine. By the late 1800s, the St. Johns River was the main source of transportation for goods and people. The lumber industry was booming with plenty of natural resources, a great mode of transport, and people willing to work. Houses such as this, the Harris Bennett farmhouse, were built along the river with lumber from local sawmills. The house and the fruit packing shed were built in the 1880s by Robert Willis. But there was a fire shortly after the house was built, but a new one was quickly reconstructed on the foundation. Robert Ellis Brooker and his wife, Julia Church Brooker, purchased the property in 1899. At the turn of the century, this was a bustling orange grove. Mr. John Harris purchased the property in 1937 and 38, but it wasn't an easy purchase. Mr. Harris and his family lived in Ortega in Jacksonville, and Mr. Harris traveled for business. In 1937, he answered an ad for a 47-acre piece of property along the St. Johns River, but with a high bluff. He was very interested, but there wasn't a clear title. Mr. Harris went on vacation, and by the time he returned, the agent reported back the title was clear. After the addition of 8 more acres, the property was his. Mr. Harris named his property Alpine Groves because it was in Switzerland. He continued to run the property as an orange grove, but his primary residence was in Jacksonville. He and his family would come out to the river on weekends and also in the summer. And rumor has it that his wife told him if they had something called indoor plumbing, she would come here more often. So he added a bathroom. They had 5 horses, a donkey, an ox, and goats. They raised chickens, and they had a vegetable garden. He is the one that planted the lovely lilies right over there.
Is that the St. John's over there? Oh, hello, folks. It looks just like the St. John's. I bet I am. I almost recognize where I am. We're about 12 miles from Calford, aren't we? Maybe a little farther. We're upriver from Calford for sure. You know, there's something different though, because the trees that were here were 18, 12 feet across. These look like children trees. You know what happened? You know, my father, who was given the title, the King's Botanist, me and him came back here in the 60s. 1765, 1766. We traveled along this river, and really we were kind of the ones that just brought attention to the inner parts of this place that the French call La Ferita. La Ferita, the land of flowers. You know, it's interesting because there was a lot of flowers, so much I gained the title. Huggy, the natives called me, meant flower hunter. I was fascinated with the flowers. And the natives seemed to understand a lot about how the wilderness managed itself. They would set these fires when they wouldn't have normal lightning fires, and right afterwards, all these flowers would appear right out of where the burns happened. You would think it would be destructive, but it wasn't. It was amazing, and I could find lots of flowers afterwards. I'm a little bit cute now. Can you still drink the water? We could drink the water right here. All the way to Calford, it was fresh. Sure, it had a little coffee tinge at times, but it was fresh. We could drink it. I hope it's still fresh enough to drink now. Of course, after Calford, it became salt, you know, a lot of salt water, so it wasn't really capable of drinking at that point. You know, something that we were known for, me and my father, John Bartram, were known for bringing this new science back or forward towards to society. And it was about learning how to take plants and species and putting them into families and doing the genus and species and learning all about the different ways they grow or interact, the similarities, the differences between them. We actually were able to bring this into a way of communicating across the world of different species and similar species from around the world. My father, he was just a farmer. He taught himself Latin and a few other terminologies and was able to dive right in. Of course, people call him the botanist. And me, now I've tried many things, but when I heard my father was going to go on a great expedition up the St. John's River, a river that flowed north down in the southern colonies after British became rule of East and West La Ferita, I had to go. So I liquidated everything. I was trying to be a store owner at the time. I liquidated everything I had and joined my father in this great adventure. And I got to do my favorite thing, which was drawing and exploring. That's the one thing I was really good at. So most of my drawings went alongside with what my father was discovering, and I loved it so much. Later on in the, is it 1774. Sorry. I came back here on my own and decided to continue studying and continue. And I even wrote a book all about my travels from North Carolina all the way down through the southern native areas and into Florida, which was one of my favorites. I tried my hand at growing around here. It was really wonderful, but I was really better at an explorer and a botanist, a naturalist. Some people even call me an artist. But you know, I really consider myself a pilgrim, a philosopher, and a pilgrim of nature. You know, I'm not sure of your connection with the natural world, but if you can go out and smell like I did, the morning sun coming up, everything changes in that wilderness area. You can smell the moss. If you're close to the ocean, you can smell that salt air. If you're right here, like on the St. John's, it's a beautiful morning of birds with a chorus right before the sun comes up. It's a huge chorus of birds. Wakes you up. It's the perfect way to wake up. There's a voice out there. There's a voice out there in the quiet of nature that I hope you find, like I did. You have to become more aware. You have to use your eyes and see not just what's right in front of you, but see beyond. You have to look at the colors and the tones and the changes like an artist would. You have to listen with your ears and expand as far as you can. You have to touch and not be scared to touch the ground and the water. Let your toes dig into the marshes. Become part of your natural world. And you too can hear the voice I'm talking about. It will connect you. It will guide you. Just like it guided me. It still does today. I wonder if I can find my flower again. You know, I've heard that the largest spring in the world is in La Farita. And there's been talk about it drying up if it goes the way it's, my understanding, it is going in this way. Something to think about. Something to look at. Go dig your toes in the springs. Go listen to the voice. See what it's saying to you.
Did I see someone that looked a little like Billy Bartram? My grandfather mentioned him a time or two. But where are they? They were out here the last time I was here. I'm looking for them. Excuse me, do you know where the alligators are? Oh, Mr. Harris kept them right around there in a sort of a pit. Did Mr. Harris invite you all here for a picnic of some sort? No, the clothes are all wrong. And when I peeked over there in the curio barn, it was empty? My. What year is this? What year? I'll be shocked. Well, what is the number? 2021. 2021? My, it has been a while since I've been out here. The last time I was out here, it was Alpine Groves, run by Mr. Harris. Quite an interesting family. And an interesting gentleman, too. You see, that curio barn around there, it was called the Switzerland Smithsonian. And I was here one time, and the school children were lined up for a peek inside to see some of his collections. He traveled all around the world for work, and he had many interesting, different, and sometimes strange collections. He had some women's hats, beautiful women's hats, leather trunks stacked up. He had bear skins. He also had stuffed birds and magnificent carriages. Oh, and the alligators. He had dug some sort of pit, and he would keep alligators in them, and you could come and look at them up close as much as one would like to get near an alligator. Very, very interesting curiosity. Oh, and you know, his daughter Ruth would sometimes come out here too, and I would see her playing with her friends. They would laugh and run and play and ride horseback. It reminded me of my girlhood out here many years before that. I apologize, I haven't introduced myself, have I? My name is Louisa Facio, and I'm the granddaughter of Francis Philip Facio. I was born here in New Switzerland in 1797. My father was Francis Philip Facio Jr., and my mother, Miss Susan Hunter Facio. I didn't really get to ever know her, though. She passed when I was only 1 year old. My childhood out here along the river was one of learning and exploration. My grandfather built a beautiful home after the European styles, being from Switzerland and all. My favorite room was the library. He had many volumes, lots of things to read and consider. It was very important for our family that myself and my sister Eliza and then our step-siblings learn how to read and write and do arithmetic. And boy, did they keep us in our paces. It's very important to learn how the home was run. But we did get some time in there for exploring. My sister and Eliza and I love to take walks through the orange trees. We had over 3,000 trees. We also grew indigo for dye, and we did some oak timber and turpentine operations, but we dared not go near those. They were very dangerous, especially for a young lady. Eliza and I also like to find our way to the wharf and watch the boats go by, and sometimes they'd stop to see us. That was always a cause for celebration. Things were just peaceful, and it was a lovely time to grow up. About my 15th year, 1812, things did get tense, and we had to leave our home for a while. That was the time of the East Florida Patriot War. Have any of you heard of that? Some people call it America's Other War of 1812. You see, the Americans had moved down here to Spanish Florida, and some of them wanted to become part of the United States. So did some Georgians want the Floridians to. So the Georgians thought that they would get the Floridians to do this with a little force. And obviously they didn't win, it didn't work, but our plantation fell victim to one of their skirmishes. Half of it was burned down. We had to flee out to the river and get away on boat as fast as we could. It was terrifying. We did find shelter in St. Mary's and then Fernandina. That was the first time I'd ever been away from this place, my home. We weren't really that far, but it did seem so very far away. I did find a little bit of solace and some hope for the future, because my father planned parties and dinners for some of the Navy officers that were coming into Fernandina at the time. And that was where I met him, the man who would have been my husband. We had a sweet courtship, an engagement. I daydreamed about everything that was to come, our home, our wedding, our children. But that wasn't to be. The day that I got the news that he perished at sea was one of the hardest days of my life. And it's still hard all these years later. To take my mind off things, I just dove into my family and my home. We came back out to New Switzerland, our home was repaired, and my stepmother Mary needed help with the children. She was rather ill at the time, and that's what I did. I dove into it, and I kept those little rapscallions in line. I did. I taught them like I had been taught all those years. Sadly, in 1828, my stepmother Mary passed away, and my sister Eliza moved to St. Augustine, left us for the big city. A few years later, my father also passed away, and that was heartbreaking. After that, 4 years later, our whole entire plantation and home was burned to the ground in the Second Seminole Indian War. That was it. That was all I could take. So I decided to go and live with Eliza in St. Augustine. St. Augustine at the time was a bustling city. There were many soldiers and refugees from the war, so it was easy for me to find a job as a hostess at one of the local boarding houses there along the bayfront. About 1840, I started working at what you all might know as the Jimenez Facio House on Adelaide Street in St. Augustine. I loved it. I loved planning out, laying out the table, planning out the meals, making sure that the lodging and the accommodations were clean and pristine for our guests. In about 1855, Mrs. Anderson, the owner, afforded me the opportunity to purchase the property for $3,000. Now, that may not be a big deal in your time, but in my time it really was. Women weren't afforded the same rights as you are, and we could only own property if we had stayed unmarried or were widowed. So after the purchase of the property, it became known as Miss Facios. And the word around town was I was a consummate hostess and I was great with all the logistics. And who am I to argue with that, right? Mr. Charles Landman. Have any of you heard of him? The writer, Charles Landman. He wrote a book called Adventures in the Wilds of the United States, and he mentioned me by name. He said he called me a popular and estimable lady. Can you imagine that? I loved my time at the boarding house. I loved running a boarding house. I loved all the interesting people that I got to meet. But I also loved the opportunity it gave me to take care of my family. And family is so important to me. See, when I owned the property, I decided to build a second story on the north end of the main wing of the house. And I did that for visitors, yes, but also so my half-sister, Sophia, could come and live with me, and so that I could house my sister Eliza's children. When my dear Eliza passed away, I knew that I must take care of them and show them the love and care that we had grown up with all those years. So I did try to make a difference with my family, and as a hostess, I know you guys understand. And I know you all are making a difference in your family, in your community too. I can just tell. So, where can I find some alligators?
I was just coming outside to paint for a little bit. I like to do that on a nice Saturday afternoon. Isn't this a lovely view in this beautiful home? I've spent many an afternoon here and at my house just up the river in Mandarin, painting and admiring the wildlife and visiting with people as they come by. Excuse me, let me introduce myself, please. I'm Mrs. Stowe. You may have heard of me. I wrote a little book a while back that caused a little bit of a stir here in the South. In fact, President Lincoln once called me the little woman that wrote the book that started this great war, meaning, of course, the American Civil War. So how does a minister's daughter born in Litchfield, Connecticut, end up down here in the South in Mandarin, Florida? Well, my early years were heavily influenced by my father. He held abolitionist beliefs, particularly regarding the issue of slavery. His beliefs really set the stage for me and for my feelings and my beliefs and what I would write about in the future. As a young girl, I joined the Semicolon Society, which was a writers group of other young people of like mind. And I paid special attention to a young gentleman named Calvin Ellis Stowe. He was a local seminary teacher. Well, Calvin and I began courting, and he loved me not only as a woman, but he loved me as a writer. He encouraged me to do what I wanted to do. Now, in our time, that was not heard of. Women didn't just do things like that. But Mr. Stowe encouraged me to do the thing that I loved and the thing that would ultimately make a difference in our lives and in many lives. I'm a writer, not an actor. So I wrote a book of short stories. I started that, it was published in 1843, and it was called The Mayflower. And I wrote that all the while keeping our home and raising our 7 children. Mr. Stowe and I both held anti-slavery beliefs, but certain events in our lives prompted us to take a stand, and myself especially with the writing, it prompted me to take a stand that would end up with the writing of my book, which I have a copy here, Uncle Tom's Cabin. We found out that one of our servants, when we were living in Maine, was a runaway slave. That put us in touch with an organization called the Underground Railroad. And we were involved in helping people that were trying to escape this situation, and we learned a lot about that. And then also at the same time, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. Now that made it against the law for anyone to help an escaped slave. Well, I started thinking myself and people of conscience like myself, we could actually get arrested for doing what we knew was right. I had to do something to tell the story about that. At about that same time, my sister, she wrote me a letter, and in it she said, "Hattie, if I could write like you, I would write a book that told the story of what an accursed thing this slavery is." Well, that really got me thinking. I could really tell the story of what was happening. We had another experience that made me view what was going on with slavery in a very personal way. Our precious 18-month-old Samuel suffered from cholera and died in 1849. As I mourned his loss, it really made me think about the women, the mothers of the children enslaved. How horrible it must be for them to see their children sold off into a life of uncertainty, cruelty, and misery. I finally had confirmation of what had to happen in church in 1851. I heard a sermon about abolition, and the minister used the verse, "Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, ye have done it unto me." Sitting there that day, I saw a vision of the book that I must write. I had to shake the conscience of our nation. I knew that people weren't as adamant about slavery as I was because they just didn't know about the cruelty of it firsthand. In writing Uncle Tom's Cabin, I saw myself as a painter, painting a picture of what depicted what slavery was like. It was compiled into book form and published as a book in 1852. And it just exploded. 2 million copies were sold in the first 5 years. It was translated into 37 languages, second only to the Bible at that time. We took 3 trips to Europe in 6 years to publicize the book. What a confirmation it was for me that I had done the right thing. Many people were appalled as they read about slavery, and they joined the cause. As you can imagine, many Southerners refuted the facts, so I even wrote a paper citing my sources. This was 9 years before the Civil War actually began, and Uncle Tom's Cabin definitely added to the tensions between the North and the South. Even President Lincoln took note of that. So, how did we end up down here? Right up the river in Sleepy Mandarin, Florida? Not sure we'd be quite welcome. Well, after the war, my son Frederick started a cotton farm he called Laurel Grove, right across the river from here, in a town that you now call Orange Park. You see, Northerners with our mindset after the war felt like we had to buy property down here in the war-ravaged South in order to help people rebuild and provide opportunities for people to work. So while visiting my son at Laurel Grove, we had to row across the river into Mandarin to pick up our mail. Well, I just fell in love with the moss-draped oaks, the waters of the St. John's, and the people here were just so wonderful. And from this side of the river, the sunsets are spectacular. So in 1867, I purchased 30 acres on the St. John's, just east of where the Mandarin Community Club is now. I built myself a cottage with distinct wooden pillars, columns, and window ornamentation, and I turned the whole land into an orange grove. Thanks to the Homestead Acts and the money that I earned from the book, I was able to do this and buy the land myself. Again, not something many women could do, especially when they were married. I ran that orange grove myself. I hired and I overseed the planters, the pickers. Many of them were freedmen. I even made my own shipping labels that said, oranges from Harriet Beecher Stowe, Mandarin, Florida. It was quite the thing in the North to receive oranges from Harriet Beecher Stowe's groves. My husband and family organized the Episcopal Church of Our Savior in Mandarin. We also compelled the Freedmen's Bureau to build a school for the African American children in Mandarin. And although, as I said, I'm a writer and not an actor, I performed in many community plays with my daughters. When I wasn't involved in business and civic activities, I painted pictures of oranges and magnolias or worked on my writing. I wrote many travel articles for northern publications encouraging people to visit Florida. I wrote about the moss-draped oaks and the orange trees and the quiet, the calm, the sunsets. It's the Mediterranean of the South. My writings about Florida became the book Palmetto Leaves. I just love this area, and I must say that in all my years of living here, I have never had any incivility from any native Floridian. But it's 1884. My dear husband has fallen ill. We've been here almost 20 years, but we must return to Connecticut. We've left an endowment behind at the Church of Our Savior for a stained glass window to be installed in honor of my dear Calvin. As I take my leave of you today, I look out here and I wonder, which of you are making a difference in your community? It's a wonderful feeling.
About Harriet Beecher Stowe reminds me of my stepfather, Stetson Kennedy. Mrs. Stowe wrote words that tried to help slaves, and Stetson used his words and work to help blacks of the Jim Crow South. Stetson was a Jacksonville native and went to Robert E. Lee High School. His father owned property in St. Johns County in what is now known as Tallugahatchee Park. He was born in 1916 and grew up in a household typical of the time. But he saw things around him that made him question society. He heard personal stories from a black woman who worked for his family that made him question why things were the way they were. His father owned a furniture store, and he would collect $1 every week for furniture that was sold for $1 down, $1 a week. Stetson saw firsthand the impact of the $1 a week and what it had on the family and on their ability to buy food. He signed up with the WPA, the Federal Writers Project, in 1937, and at the young age of 21 was put in charge of folklore, oral history, and ethnic studies. He traveled around the state recording stories from all kinds of people. Migrant farm workers, Florida cracker cowboys, cigar factory workers, sponge divers, and others. During this time, he worked with Zora Neale Hurston, a writer and folklorist in her own right. Stetson learned the word Tallugahatchee from Zora, a place where all unpleasantness is forgotten and forgiven. Stetson then traveled to Atlanta and infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan and several other hate groups. He became an unofficial, undercover agent and gave the information he learned to law enforcement in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. He passed on information like secret handshakes and code words to several radio programs. Before he knew it, there was a series of episodes of Superman taking on the Klan, using actual KKK references that Stetson had provided. After his time in Atlanta, He lived in New York for a couple of years, writing and promoting social justice and workers' rights. He then returned to Florida in 1950 and ran as a write-in candidate for the United States Senate. His friend Woody Guthrie even wrote a campaign song for him. Woody visited Beluthahachie a couple of times, and while he was there, wrote over 80 songs and finished his autobiography, Seeds of Man. After losing the Senate race with a KKK contract out on him, Stetson left our Switzerland for Geneva, Switzerland. While there, he testified about forced labor camp practices at Florida turpentine camps. He ended up staying over in Europe for most of the decade. In the 60s, he returned to Jacksonville and joined protests at a local Woolworths lunch counter. That protest is now known as Axe Handle Saturday. Stetson was also involved in the Martin Luther King Jr. protests in St. Augustine and reported on them for the Pittsburgh Courier. For the rest of his life, Stetson focused on writing and social activism and folklore. I admire Stetson because at such a young age, he resolved to stand up for people, all people, the poor, the working class, African Americans, and he did that for his entire life. He fought for freedom for everyone. So, who in this audience would be brave enough to look hate in the face and make a change? Would you use your talents to expose problems in society?
Well, folks, now it's your turn. You find yourself here in this place. What interesting and important things will you do?
What outstanding things will you do?
Will you stand up for what is right, like Stetson Kennedy?
Will you follow your convictions, like Harriet Beecher Stowe?
Will you be hardworking, hospitable, and caring, like Miss Louisa Facio?
Will you be a teacher of nature and history, like Beverly Fleming, local hero and naturalist, and William Bartram?
What will you do?
As I went walking that ribbon of highway, I saw above me the endless skyway, and all below me that golden valley. This land was made for you and me. This land was your land. This land is my land. From the California to the New York Islands, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. I roamed and rambled, followed my footsteps from the sparkling sands of her diamond deserts, and all around me a voice was sounding. This land was made for you and me. This land is your land. This land is my land. From the California to the New York Island, from the redwood forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me. And the sun was shining, and I was strolling, and the wheat fields waving, and the dust clouds rolling.